What if the foods you've been told are heart healthy are quietly accelerating plaque buildup, and the real answer has been hiding in plain sight? What if one of the biggest mistakes we make about heart disease starts long before a heart attack, long before a blocked artery, and long before any warning sign ever appears? What if it starts with a question that almost all of us are asking the wrong way? For years, I've been fascinated by biology, not just because it's science, but because it's one of the few fields where the deeper you look, the more you realize how little the simple answers actually explain. And nowhere has that been more obvious to me than in nutrition. Every time I hear people talk about heart health, the conversation seems to turn into a battlefield. One person says carbohydrates are destroying our arteries. Another says animal products are the real problem. Someone else points to the Mediterranean diet. Then there's keto, vegan, carnivore, paleo, DASH, and countless experts who all sound completely convinced that they've found the answer. The strange part is that many of these people can point to studies, many can point to real-world success stories. Yet somehow they often arrive at entirely different conclusions. That contradiction kept bothering me. Because if the science is supposed to lead us toward truth, why does it sometimes feel like everyone is walking in opposite directions? The more I thought about it, the more I realized something important. Maybe we're so focused on finding the perfect diet that we're missing a much bigger story unfolding underneath. After spending countless hours reading about cardiovascular biology, one idea kept resurfacing in my mind. What if the label of the diet matters far less than the biological processes happening inside our bodies every single day? What if the foods that truly matter are not the foods promoted by the loudest voices, but the ones that quietly keep showing up across decades of research? And perhaps even more surprising, what if a diet that's only good enough for the next 20 years is actually far more powerful than a perfect diet that lasts 6 months? That question sent me down a path I wasn't expecting, because once I began looking beyond diatribes and nutrition trends, I discovered a pattern hidden beneath the noise. A pattern that starts with understanding how plaque forms inside our arteries in the first place, and why certain foods seem to appear again and again whenever scientists search for answers. And the deeper I followed that pattern, the more I realized that understanding plaque is far more important than memorizing another list of good and bad foods. One of the biggest surprises I encountered while learning about cardiovascular biology was discovering that plaque doesn't form because of a single bad actor. Before diving into the research, I think I unconsciously viewed heart disease the same way many people do. Cholesterol goes up, arteries clog, problems happen. Simple, clean, easy to understand, but biology rarely tells stories that simple. What I found instead was a chain reaction unfolding over years, sometimes decades, inside blood vessels that most of us never think about. At the center of this story is the endothelium, a remarkably thin layer of cells lining the inside of our arteries. Despite being only one cell thick, it plays an enormous role in maintaining vascular health. It helps regulate blood flow, influences inflammation, and produces nitric oxide, a molecule that allows blood vessels to relax and function properly. When this protective lining becomes damaged, the environment inside the artery begins to change. LDL particles carrying ApoB can move beneath the surface of the vessel wall. On their own, these particles are not necessarily the entire problem. What becomes dangerous is what happens next. In an environment filled with oxidative stress, some of these particles become oxidized. That oxidation acts almost like a distress signal, attracting the attention of the immune system. Soon, immune cells arrive to clean up the damage, but instead of resolving the situation, the response can become chronic. Inflammation grows, more particles accumulate, more immune activity follows. Layer by layer, the plaque gradually develops. What fascinated me most was realizing that this process isn't driven by one mechanism, but by several working together. Endothelial dysfunction, ApoB containing lipoproteins, oxidative stress, inflammation, immune overactivation. They form a biological feedback loop that reinforces itself over time. And that realization completely changed how I look at food. Instead of asking whether a particular diet is right or wrong, I began asking a different question: which foods influence these mechanisms in the most favorable direction? Because once you understand the process, the nutritional patterns that keep appearing in the research suddenly start making a lot more sense. Once I started looking at nutrition through the lens of biology rather than diet labels, certain foods kept appearing so consistently that it became impossible for me to ignore them. What struck me wasn't that these foods belonged to one particular eating philosophy. In fact, many of them show up across completely different dietary patterns. The common thread wasn't the diet itself, it was the biological effect. One of the first patterns I noticed involved lycopene-rich foods. Tomatoes, watermelon, guava, papaya, and pink grapefruit all contain this powerful carotenoid. The more I learned about oxidative stress and its role in damaging cells, the more fascinating lycopene became. Research has suggested that higher carotenoid levels may be associated with slower progression of atherosclerosis, which makes sense when you consider that plaque development is fueled, in part, by oxidative damage accumulating over time. Then, there are phytosterols, compounds naturally found in foods like flax seeds, sesame seeds, legumes, whole grains, avocados, and leafy greens. What I find elegant about phytosterols is how they work with the body's existing systems. Because they resemble cholesterol, they compete for absorption in the digestive tract. This can ultimately encourage the liver to remove more LDL particles from circulation, targeting one of the major contributors to plaque formation. Another recurring theme throughout the literature is flavonoids. Berries, apples, citrus fruits, onions, leafy greens, and even dark chocolate contain these compounds. The way I think about flavonoids is that they help create a calmer environment inside blood vessels. Instead of allowing inflammation and oxidative damage to escalate unchecked, they appear to support healthier interactions between the immune system and the vascular wall. Green and black tea are especially interesting because of their catechin content, and several large studies have linked regular tea consumption with a lower risk of stroke. Then, there is extra virgin olive oil and fatty fish. Again and again, these foods appear in cardiovascular research. Olive oil brings polyphenol and healthy fats that support vascular function, while fish like salmon, sardines, and mackerel provide omega-3 fatty acids that help regulate inflammation and support plaque stability. The more I explored these findings, the more I realized something surprising. The strongest nutritional patterns weren't built around restriction. They were built around consistently giving the body compounds it seems to benefit from most. But the more I learned about what seems to support cardiovascular health, the more I realized that understanding what to limit can be just as important as understanding what to add. One of the most surprising lessons from studying nutrition is how often perception and biology fail to match. We tend to trust packaging, marketing language, and familiar health claims, yet our bodies respond to what is actually inside the food, not the story wrapped around it. I remember becoming increasingly skeptical whenever I saw products advertised as heart healthy, without looking beyond the label. The deeper I dug, the more I noticed a recurring pattern. Many of these foods were carrying a hidden burden of added sugars or highly processed ingredients. Flavored yogurts are a good example. At first glance, they seem like an obvious health food. They contain dairy, protein, and often images of fruit on the packaging. But many versions contain enough added sugar to make me question whether consumers are really getting what they think they're buying. That's why I find plain yogurt paired with fresh fruit to be such a simple but meaningful alternative. It allows you to control the sweetness rather than letting a manufacturer decide for you. The same concern applies to many breakfast bars and granola bars. their branding often creates an impression of wellness, convenience, and balanced nutrition. Yet when you examine ingredient lists, some are essentially refined carbohydrates and sugars packaged in a more attractive form. It's a reminder that health marketing can sometimes create a halo effect that disguises the underlying nutritional reality. Fruit juice may be the most fascinating example of all. Whole fruit consistently appears in research as part of a healthy dietary pattern, yet juice behaves differently. Once the fiber is removed, the natural sugars become easier and faster to consume. What was originally packaged by nature in a slow delivery system becomes concentrated into a liquid that can be consumed in minutes. What I've come to appreciate is that biology pays very little attention to marketing categories. The body doesn't recognize foods as healthy because a label says so. It responds to molecules, nutrients, fiber, sugar, and the physiological effects they create. And that distinction has fundamentally changed the way I look at food choices. And yet, the deeper I went into the research, the more I realized that food is only one chapter in a much larger story about cardiovascular health. One of the findings that genuinely caught my attention involved exercise, specifically high-intensity interval training, or HIIT. We often hear that exercise is good for the heart, but that's such a broad statement that it almost loses its meaning. What intrigued me was seeing research suggesting that 6 months of supervised HIIT was associated with a measurable reduction in plaque volume. When I first came across that study, I had to read it twice. A disease process that develops over many years showing signs of regression after a relatively short intervention is an idea that naturally grabs your attention. While no single study provides all the answers, it reinforced something I keep seeing throughout biology. The human body is often more adaptable than we give it credit for. Another area I found surprisingly interesting was aged garlic extract. I'll admit that if someone had asked me years ago whether garlic would become a topic in cardiovascular research, I probably wouldn't have thought much of it. Yet multiple randomized controlled trials have suggested potential benefits related to plaque stability, blood pressure, and slower progression of coronary artery calcification. What fascinates me isn't that garlic is somehow magical, but that compounds found in ordinary foods can have measurable biological effects when studied carefully. Then there is sauna therapy, which may be one of the most intriguing examples of how lifestyle influences the body in ways we're still trying to fully understand. The evidence doesn't directly show plaque reversal, but studies have linked regular sauna use with improvements in endothelial function, healthier blood pressure patterns, and lower rates of cardiovascular events. Even more interesting is the possibility that some benefits may stem from repeatedly exposing the body to mild, controlled stress and allowing it to adapt. When I step back and look at everything we've explored, one theme stands above all the rest. The goal isn't to find a miracle food, a miracle supplement, or a miracle habit. It's to consistently create conditions that help the body function better over time. And perhaps that's the most hopeful lesson hidden within all of this science. Small advantages, repeated for years, can become something remarkably powerful. If there's one lesson I've taken away from exploring the science of heart health, it's that lasting results rarely come from extreme solutions. The body responds to what we do consistently, not occasionally. Instead of chasing the next perfect diet, focus on building simple habits that support your biology every day. Eat more whole foods, move regularly, manage stress, and prioritize long-term consistency over short-term perfection. Small choices may seem insignificant in the moment, but over years they can profoundly shape your health, energy, and quality of life. The goal isn't perfection, it's creating better conditions for your body to thrive. I'm curious to hear your perspective. Which one habit from today's video do you think would be the easiest for you to start this week? Please share your answer in the comments below so everyone can learn from each other's experiences and ideas. And if you enjoyed this video and want more science-based health content explained in a practical and easy-to-understand way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and support our work. Your support helps keep these videos coming and motivates us to create even more valuable content in the future.